This is the lecture on part 2 of the population biology series. And so we had just left off talking about carrying capacity and how environmental resistance acts to keep down the growth caused by your biotic potential. And so in this next slide here, we're going to talk about some other things that can limit you. What are those factors of environmental resistance that are pushing a population to keep its carrying capacity low? And so the first thing that comes up here is the range of tolerance. And those are the conditions, the range of conditions that are optimal for a population to maintain and to live and thrive normally. Okay, so again, normal function is key because you can still live, but if you can't function properly, then you're technically out of your range of tolerance. So in this next slide, we see what that range of tolerance looks like. And you see that it's a bell-shaped curve, and we optimally want to be in this middle region where you see an abundance of organisms. And in this example, they've given us fish and they've given us temperature as the variable in question. What we can see is that when the temperature either gets too high or too low, that we start to stress the organisms. Again, we're talking about fish, but it could be plants with sunlight. It could be talking about the fish in our ecocolumns with ammonia concentrations. And so there are limits. Again, the next step out is going to be the zone of stress. And then if we get too far away from that optimal range, we get to the zone of intolerance where there would be very, very few to no organisms. And you see right here in these sections that there could be a few, but again, they wouldn't have normal function. Even these would be stressed to some degree. Maybe they wouldn't be able to reproduce. Maybe they wouldn't be able to hibernate properly, but it's going to be some type of change to their normal niche. Limiting factors is maybe a little bit easier of a concept. A limiting factor is just that thing that limits the growth, abundance, or distribution of a population in an ecosystem. So basic definition there. But we could talk about something like food being a limiting factor. If you have a population of deer in a forest, they have to eat from the trees. They're browsers. If we have a lack of trees or lack of undergrowth in the shrubby area where they would be eating from, then we can't have as many deer. So you can see that food is a limiting factor for how the population can grow. It could be sunlight for plants, it could be water, nutrients, especially phosphate. We talked about phosphate before in the phosphate cycle, and we said that it is a major limiting factor for plant growth. So what that means is that if there is not enough phosphorus, plants cannot grow. They are limited in their growth by the abundance of phosphorus. Limiting factor principle, too much or too little of a factor can limit or prevent growth of a population, even if everything else is at or near optimal range of tolerance. So again, if we're talking about something like that temperature, we can have perfect pH for our fish, we can have perfect ammonia, perfect nitrogen, but if one thing, the temperature is off, we will destroy that population's ability to survive and reproduce. We will prevent their ability to grow as a population. So that's the limiting factor principle. Basically, we have to go with the lowest common denominator. Whatever it is that is most stressful to our population, that's what's going to limit our growth. Okay, so here we're looking at some growth of populations and how carrying capacity can be seen, and just a basic case study of Tasmania 1800 to 1995. Now what happened in Tasmania is that they brought these sheep in as a source of food, as a source of wool, lots of different uses for sheep. And we can see that in 1800 we've got our population, our real population shown in green. It starts out with exponential growth. They have no limit to their biotic potential. So no limit to biotic potential. As we keep growing and growing, now we've got over 1.5 million sheep. The population has grown so far that they have run out of resources and they face what we call a dieback. So population crashes. We see now that they are below what we've figured out to be our carrying capacity, so they're able once again to grow. No limits because they're underneath their threshold. Their limiting factors are not limits at this point. They've got plenty of food. And we see the numbers go up and come down once again. So if you're ever given a graph and asked to find the carrying capacity, what you need to do is look for the point around which your population line goes up and down. Anytime you're below the line, you have potential for biotic growth. Okay, it's your biotic potential. Anytime you're above the line, you face environmental resistance. And there's a little bit of a lag because these sheep that were below the line can reproduce. The sheep that were born into that then are the ones who face the catastrophe of running out of resources, and they're the ones who will die off. When you do have a population exceed its carrying capacity, then again, we're going to be talking about a population crash. Carrying capacity is not fixed, though. You can increase your carrying capacity. One way to think about this is what farmers typically do with their cattle. They bring in food. They'll bring in hay, they'll bring in corn feed, but they don't just limit themselves to the grass that's there. Also, you could have changes. You could have a drought year and there's not as much grass. So either from natural or from man-made reasons, your carrying capacity is not set in stone. Again, I talked about that reproductive time lag. There's going to be a period where the organisms feel like they've got plenty of resources, reproduction is high, but then they go past, but then they've gone past where their limiting factors provide them nourishment and they overshoot and have a dieback. The damage may reduce an area's carrying capacity. We could have damage from a flood, we could have damage from a fire, we could have damage from the population itself. The deer population in the eastern forest in the United States do quite a number and can sometimes destroy the forest, which will diminish the area's carrying capacity for the deer themselves. All right, this population is showing a massive dieback. We've got right here a reindeer population, and we see that their numbers start to increase. Population way overshoots its carrying capacity, and then the population crashes. And this could have happened, if we see and look at these numbers right here, could have happened because there was a plentiful abundant year, could have happened because we were bringing in resources. But what we've set ourselves up for is a massive dieback. Again, though, there's a time lag. These caribou might be pretty good at withstanding a couple years of hardship, but in the end, they're going to die back beneath their carrying capacity. Under some circumstances, population density can affect population size. So density independent controls, these are things that the size of your population does not matter. A weather event, a natural disaster, they're going to come whether or not you have a big population, very densely packed, or a small population. So like a volcano, it doesn't care if the caribou are high in numbers or low in numbers. A volcano is going to strike when a volcano strikes. Weather events, droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, all of those things have no dependency on the density of the population. However, predation, parasitism, disease, and competition are very much driven by the density of your population. I like to think about people and the infectious disease idea. We know that if you're in a city, you are much more likely to catch an infectious disease from another person. Obviously, competition, the more closely packed you are, the more competition there's going to be. And so those things, again, are determined directly by the size of your population, how densely packed you are. Population changes occur over time in nature. There's 4 different types. Stable makes sense. A population doesn't change too much over time. An eruptive population is like the reindeer graph that I showed you a couple slides ago. We have this massive growth followed by a massive dieback, and then things will stabilize after that. Cyclic fluctuations are more typical in nature, and this is what we were seeing in the lab that we did last week with the mice and the weasels. What you have with cyclical fluctuations is a predator population and a prey population are going through ups and downs with each other. Now, there is debate on whether it is a top-down control or a bottom-up control. So the question there is, are the mice controlling how big the weasel population gets, or is the weasel population controlling how big the mice population gets? And there is still a lot of debate amongst ecologists about that, and I believe you even have a question about that on your lab follow-up. The last type of population change in nature is irregular, and it is precisely what it sounds like. It's irregular. There's no rhyme or reason to what we see, and we can't figure it out. It doesn't look like cycles.
Attention, please.
And this picture is what your lab graph would have looked like could we carry it out for multiple generations. We already did 15, and you should have seen at least 2 cycles, definitely one big growth and one smaller growth probably in that lab. But what we see here, the red line is the predator, the lynx, and the blue line is the prey species, the hare. Now, sometimes they seem rather independent of one another, but in general, the trend is that we have peaks at around the same time and valleys around the same time. Now, if we look at this graph, it appears at first this lynx population grows before the hare. So what we need to see in order to determine is it top, down, or bottom up is which typically happens first. Do we typically see the increase in predator or the increase in prey first? And what it tends to be seeing here is an increase in hare before the increase in the lynx. But you could consider it top down because the increase in lynx is immediately followed by a decrease in hare. And this is why ecologists can't agree. Humans are not exempt from population control. A couple examples: Ireland, the potato crop famine in 1845, the famous Irish potato famine. This is, again, it's a disease. It was density dependent in the potato crop, but that affected us as well. Bubonic plague, again, was striking the cities where people were densely packed. And AIDS today, it spread from person to person, so we tend to see it in villages, it spread out from there, but these are forms of population control. We can see massive dips in human population graphs at the times when these events occurred. And we've talked a little bit about deer already, and you can see from the case study in your book that the white-tailed deer population in the U.S. has definitely gone uncontrolled. And the reason why is that we do not any longer have the predator species in place. Now, in the 1900s, we'd already destroyed the wolf population, but we were also destroying deer habitat and had uncontrolled hunting, which left the deer population in a failing state. We then enacted laws to protect the deer, and now there are too many deer. The problems with that are related to humans are an increase in Lyme disease, deer vehicle accidents, eating garden plants and shrubs. Obviously that one not nearly as important as the Lyme disease and the accidents. And so we have to think of ways to control the deer population. So one thing people have considered is let's reintroduce the wolf, reintroduce the predator that puts that top-down control on the deer population. Okay, I'm going to stop here for part 2. My recording is almost out of time, and the next recording for part 3 of the lecture is going to be very short, just a couple more topics to cover.